A big welcome to you all. Thank you for watching this. It's the second part of Willobie His Avisa, in which we will continue to examine this extraordinary work published in 1594 that was banned by the bishops because obviously it was highly libellous and they consigned it to the flames. In part one we looked a little bit at the history of it, and we looked also intensely at this title page. So I won't go over that again, but just lightly to remind you of a couple of the things we were looking at. The two cherubs right at the top, who are symbols of erotic love, each with an arm dangling over an antler. Antlers, horns, these are the symbols of cuckoldry. And you can see that with one arm each, they're pointing, perhaps accusatory way, and they're looking perhaps with reproach down onto two figures beneath them. The one on the right is the well-known mythological figure of Diana, and the one on the left, who is the Greek goddess Pallas Minerva. We also noted that if we got rid of all that writing in the middle and pushed them both together, they appear to be hiding together underneath a sheet or a blanket, as though they were lovers hiding from the cuckold above them. And we're not obviously saying that the goddess Diana and the goddess Minerva are lesbians or anything like that. We know perfectly well that in Renaissance England, amongst intellectual circles, these goddesses and gods were wheeled out as allusions to living people. And since this is a book all about scandal, we wondered to ourselves who these living people might be. Is Avisa the new Diana? Is Minerva, Pallas Minerva, is that a reference to Shakespeare? Actually, fun enough, you only have to go to the very first page, just open it up, and you see two prefatory poems. In the first, you are clued in straight away that Avisa is indeed a new Diana, and on the page immediately opposite, you see Shake-Spear paints poor Lucrece rape. So straight away we are being clued into the fact that Diana is Avisa and the new Diana is represented as the new Diana. Well, this was published, as I say, in 1594, and it was only 2 years earlier that Constable published the famous poems called Diana, the Praises of His Mistress, to Penelope Rich. So there's a big clue that the new Diana, the person everyone's calling Diana at court in 1594, is Penelope Rich, and she is represented by Avisa, and she must have been having an affair, despite the fact that she's married to someone else, with the poet who wrote Lucrece, published literally that very same year, 1594, described here as Shake-Spear, and obviously described as that to allude to the goddess Pallas. Interesting thing here is if you look at Pallas, you see she doesn't actually have a spear. This is an extraordinary part of the technique of this book, that what is going on time and time again, and I'm going to show you some more examples, is that this book is written for highly learned, highly intelligent people who know what should be there, and by seeing what is missing, they can pick up the message, the hidden underlying message about this great scandal at court. So here on the left you see Pallas Athena with Pallas Minerva, if you like, with no fewer than 7 symbols identifying her. So there is no question whatsoever that she is Pallas Minerva, but the one symbol that she's so commonly associated with, the spear, is missing. She is the one who shakes the spear. Well, we found it over the page, and we can see it's gone from her hand and is on the name of the poet who's having the affair with the new Diana. I have highlighted Avisa just to remind those of you who have seen part 1, and to tell those who haven't, that that name derives from avis, meaning a bird in Latin, and the name Penelope, Penelops, means a certain bird in Greek. So again, that is another clue. And I also showed you in part 1, or told you in part 1, that the whole of this book is based on the ancient mythological story of Penelope. Penelope, the patient wife, who sits at home while her husband Ulysses goes off on 20 years of wandering and is assailed day after day by lewd, lusty suitors who come to kiss her grope her, go to bed with her, whatever. But she keeps saying, no, 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 you can't do that. I am not having it. Avisa is described as a constant wife, and we're going to see now how this ties in to Penelope Rich. One of the ways, of course, is her maiden name was Devereux. She was the sister of the famous Robert Devereux, who was the Earl of Essex, who had his head chopped off. And the Devereux family motto is concerned with constancy, bassis virtutum constantia, which is Latin and means constancy is the basis of virtue. And as you can well imagine, there are lots of jokes about that in this book. Avisa actually says at one point, "How boast you then of constant love, where lust all virtue doth remove?" And that line is deliberately annotated with a marginal note, which says, "Love is only constant that is grounded on virtue, bassis virtutum constantia." So you're going to get plenty of jokes like that. And in fact, she herself makes jokes to that effect. She talks in rhyme, as do all the characters in this, and set up as dialogues between her and her suitors. And she often signs off all way the same, and sometimes signs off all ways the same. So you can see what the joke is there. Constant means never changing, always the same. So this joke about her being constant is echoed in her mot, or in her poesy, as she signs off all way the same, but then she does it differently, so it's not always the same. And this is absolutely central to understanding this poem, that what is being said is very often the opposite of what is meant. So the whole book is about a woman who is claiming to be very faithful, very chaste, but in fact, if you read it carefully, you see that she's not faithful and chaste at all, that when all these suitors come along, she seems to be saying that, "Go away, I'm not going to sleep with you," but actually, if you read very carefully, she is doing precisely the opposite. Now, those of you who have seen a presentation that I put online called John Weaver Knew will remember that one of the things that we always associate with Penelope Rich, who there is described as Diana and as Lucretia and as Stella, that one of the common factors of her, she's constantly saying that she is chaste, she is boasting that she is chaste, when in fact she is not. I do encourage you to examine those two parts of John Weaver Knew to get to the bottom of this, but it's exactly the same as what's happening here. One would almost think that John Weaver is referring to this book when he does so. Just before I move on, notice that black overmantle that she's wearing. Black was Penelope Rich's favourite colour. She absolutely adored it. In her rooms at Essex House, she had black tapestries, black carpet, black bed coverings, black curtains, etc., etc., etc. And she had black eyes, famously. Philip Sidney wrote of her that whereas black seems beauty's contrary, she even in black doth make all beauties flow. And those of us who have followed what Gerald Massey wrote as long ago as 1866, he identifies her as the Dark Lady in Shakespeare's sonnets, and also as Rosaline, the black-eyed Rosaline in Love's Labour's Lost, where Shakespeare says of her that she's born to make black fair. Not everybody was so kind about her. King James called her a fair woman with a black soul, and his contemporary Richard Champernoun called her a harlot, adulteress, concubine and whore. Little bit unfair, but she did certainly sleep around, so you can see why she's called these things. She was also very bright, very sophisticated, a brilliant linguist, a great lover of poetry, a great lover of music, and a clever woman who was absolutely adored by a large circle of men. Very specifically, we know about the large circle of poets who gathered around her and kept writing poems to her, love poems, often describing her in terms of the colour black, in terms of Diana, etc., etc. Okay, so Avisa, the character in this, is Penelope Rich. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the different ways in which she can be identified as Penelope Rich, because I think it would take too long and it might send half of you to sleep. If you're really curious, I advise you to go to Google and type in Mootn, M-O-O-T-N, and Willobie His Avisa, where you'll find a scholar called Michael Mouton, who has gone into lots and lots and lots of detail, showing that in this poem Avisa is 30 years old, the same as Penelope, is born in the western part of England, same as Penelope Rich, was married for about 10 years, same as Penelope Rich. She served as a maid in the royal household, same as Penelope Rich. She's of royal stock, same as Penelope Rich. Actually, at one point she even calls her husband, Avisa calls her husband, my sweet Ulysses, or perhaps a little giveaway that he might reply to her, my sweet Penelope. But anyway, my point being that there are lots of little reasons why we can tell that Avisa is Penelope Rich. And in this presentation, I'm just going to show you two of them, one at the very, very beginning of the poem and one at the very end, partly because one of them hasn't been shown to anyone before, and I think it's really worth looking at. So, as I said, this is the story of Penelope, and the story of Penelope is she sits alone while all these suitors come to her one after another saying, "Will you kiss me?" Now, if Avisa is Penelope Rich, we can be pretty sure that the suitors are also hidden but representing real people at court who had some interest in Penelope Rich. The first suitor in this book to come along is simply called Nob. Doesn't mean anything particularly, well, it might mean something filthy, I don't know, but we're told at the time that it's short for nobleman, and this particular nobleman is quite easy to identify because he's got a very bad temper, he's furious and he's abusive. He is at one point called Nob Furens, and he's the only suitor to come to Avisa before she's married, and he says, if you kiss me, or if you go to bed with me, or whatever way he puts it, I will make you rich. So it's pretty obvious who he is. He is Robert Lord Rich, who actually married Penelope Devereux at the beginning of the 1580s. The second suitor to come along is given the name Cavallero. A very clever and delightful Oxfordian scholar called John Hamill identified him as Antonio Perez. Cavallero, we are told, is new to the country. He's only just turned up. He's obviously got something Spanish about him. He's bisexual, extremely weird and rather creepy. And all of these things apply to Antonio Perez, who arrived at the court just the year before Avisa was published in 1593. He was a Spaniard, a bisexual Spaniard, who developed a most extraordinary and rather creepy relationship with Penelope Rich. He even wrote her a letter in which he offered to have him to flay himself with a piece of my own skin from the most delicate part of my body, he writes. A letter, by the way, which he signs off, "Your Ladyship's flayed dog." So something pretty kinky was going on between Antonio Perez and Penelope Rich. Actually, one thing we also know is that her brother Essex, when he went off abroad at one point, put Antonio Perez in charge of his sister Penelope so that he would maintain her chastity. Ha ha, as if. The third suitor in this book is just simply given the initials D.B., which at one point we are told stand for Dudum Beatus, which means until lately, until recently, well off. Now, this is obviously someone who was quite rich, who's now lost his money. He's described as a mighty lord. He is a married man, he's a concealed playwright, an extremely generous patron and a poet. So it's pretty easily just on a couple of those things. If you simply take a concealed playwright, mighty lord who's recently run out of money, it's very obvious that we are talking about Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who was brought up in the environs and around Penelope Rich, who in fact is a close kin of Lord Rich, and of course a neighbour of Lord Rich, and shared with Penelope a great love of poetry and music, etc. We'll be dwelling more of that in due course. The fourth suitor to come to Avisa is given the name Didymus Harker. It's quite interesting how the clues are hidden in these names. And at one point in a piece called An Apology, the author of Avisa explains that people have tried very hard looking at these names to decipher them and work out who the real people are. I don't think this one is terribly difficult. Harco bears a pretty close resemblance to the name Charles, and we are of course talking about the soldier Charles Blunt and courtier, who had an extramarital affair with Penelope Rich and even fathered on her 5 or so children, drawing her marriage to Robert Rich, Lord Rich. So that must have been quite a big scandal, even by 1594. He's called Didymus here in this book, I think, as an allusion to the legendary soldier Didymus, who got into a prison where the beautiful, chaste virgin Theodora was being held captive, and swapped his clothes with her. I say that's an allusion, Didymus, therefore, to Charles Blount, because he famously turned up at a tilt wearing all of Penelope Rich's colours. And as the poet George Peele wrote, comes Sir Charles Blount, rich in his colours, richer in his thought, rich in his fortune, honour, arms and art. Heavy, heavy hinting clues that the fellow who turned up in Penelope Rich's colours there is, of course, Charles Blount, and therefore he's called Didymus. The 5th suitor is given the name Henry Willobie, but it's made very clear by internal evidence that Henry Willobie is a pseudonym. He's in one way the most important of the suitors because nearly a third of the book is taken up with dialogues between him and Avisa, and his name is given, drawing 99% of all this, as simply H.W. Of course, these are the same initials as Henry Willobie, the young, strapping youth, very vain, very conceited, very full of himself, who most scholars agree, is the fair youth of Shakespeare's sonnets. You remember that the fair youth shares a mistress with the poet, and we'll come to that in just a second. H.W. in this poem is an Italophile. He keeps quoting little bits of Italian, just as Henry Willobie did. And also he's a poet. Now, some of you will remember in one of the presentations I gave, which is called I think it's called The Dark Lady, Fair Youth and Shakespeare, Scandal Revealed. Have a look, that's online. Those of you who've seen it will remember that William Covell in 1595 reveals, albeit cryptically, that Henry Willobie was the author of a set of sonnets called the Diella sonnets, which are addressed to Penelope Rich. And here, in this work, Willobie His Avisa, out of the mouth of this H.W. come these mangled, lampooned, derisory versions of the Diella sonnets. We also know that a number of people felt deeply ashamed that their love poems were being almost copied verbatim in Willobie His Avisa, and we'll come to that. But clearly one of these people who was extremely anxious about that was Henry Willobie, who was finding his Diella sonnets, not yet published, being lampooned out of the mouth of H.W. in this book. Now, there's another character who appears, but he never speaks directly to Avisa. All the others speak directly to her, and she replies directly to them. He comes in under the initials W.S., and he is quite obviously William Shakespeare. That's to say, W.S. stands for William Shakespeare. And we know that he has tried to kiss Avisa because he tells us as much, and that she therefore was his mistress, and he then turns up and advises his so-called familiar friend H.W. how he might have a success and how he might get off with Avisa. And in so doing, he starts spouting poetry, which many Stratfordian critics have shown very, very closely apes a poem from The Passionate Pilgrim by William Shakespeare. So the huge numbers of people now on all sides of the so-called authorship divide have identified W.S. as William Shakespeare. Of course, this makes a terrible mess for Stratfordianists, because they're having to say that William Shakespeare, a man of a very modest background whose mother couldn't read or write, and nor could his father and nor could his children, somehow made it into bed with the same mistress that this extremely important courtier Henry Willobie was going to bed with. And that, of course, is very, very, very unlikely. And of course, if you look at the documentary evidence, there is no connection whatsoever between William Shakespeare of Stratford and Lady Penelope Rich. They simply were not moving in the same circles at all. But the coincidence of W.S. and H.W. sharing a mistress, just as they do in Shakespeare's sonnets and just as they do here, makes it beyond any reasonable doubt that we are referring to exactly the same scandal here. Of course, those of you who have seen some of the presentations I've already put up online know perfectly well that William Shakespeare is a mask. It is the mask of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And indeed, it is in the player's mask that he appears in this work. Anyone who has been following the uploads I've been putting online will know very well that lots of contemporaries knew about this great scandal and knew who the three people involved were. You can find more on it in a presentation called John Weaver Knew, to which I've already alluded. There's one called Thomas Porter Knew. There's something about Thomas Bancroft Knew. In the very year after Willobie His Avisa was published, of course, came this, and I talk about it in The Fair Youth of Dark Lady and Shakespeare Scandal Revealed, in which exactly the same triangle is hidden in the centre, with Delia representing an equivalent or parallel of Rosalie, Henry Rosalie, with Cleopatra, who's described as fortunately fortunate, and Lucretia, all names meaning rich, 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 so she's Penelope Rich, and the Earl of Oxford, who's alluded to as Sweet Shakespeare, our De Vere, a secret. Do have a look at that presentation if you haven't seen it already, because it goes on to tell you a lot more about this scandal. But just to remind you that this was published in the very year after Willobie His Avisa and after The Rape of Lucrece was published. So that is the triangle. But as I say, what I want to do in this presentation is simply to reinforce about Penelope Rich. Let's stick with this and a little explanation of how Avisa is hiding Penelope Rich. Now, as I said, I'm going to show you some evidence right from the beginning of the book, which shows that her name must be Penelope, and then I'm going to show you some evidence right from the end of the book, which shows that her last name must be Rich. So let's start at the beginning. This is a prefatory poem, and the first thing you can see about it is that it is signed Contraria Contraris and Vigilantius Dormitanus. I don't think you need to be good at Latin. You don't even have to speak Latin at all, probably, to work out what Vigilantius Dormitanus is about. We have the English words vigilant, which means wide awake, concentrating, open-eyed, and we have the English words dormitory or dormant, whatever you like, referring to sleep. So quite obviously what we've got here is two opposites, wide awake and fast asleep. In fact, what we've got here is a little hint about something that Jerome said, St. Jerome, who vigorously attacked a theologian called Vigilantius by calling him Dormitantius. So that's what that is about. But it's also giving us a clue about how to read not only this poem, but the whole book, as are the words just above, Contraria Contraris, which are taken from a quotation of Hippocrates, who says Contraria Contraris curentur, meaning the opposite is cured with the opposite. So once again, big clue here about how to read this work and how to read this poem, and the whole thing is don't just read what your surface meaning is, but think to yourself the actual opposite of what the surface meaning is what is really meant. And that's how we're going to find all about the appalling scandal that this book is about. So first thing to note, looking at this poem, is we have though, lots of those. It's taking the form of though such and such happened in classical times, yet such and such is the case in modern times. Look at the first two verses, which are both about Lucretia. Lucretia was the Roman woman whose husband unfortunately boasted about her beauty and chastity. He was called Collatine. He boasted about her beauty and her chastity, and this inflamed the lust of a fellow soldier called Tarquin, who then went off on his own and sought out Lucretia's house and forced himself upon her. So the first two of these verses are referring to that. In Lavine land, that simply means Italy. In Lavine land, though Livy boast, there hath been seen a constant dame, though Rome lament that she have lost the garland of her rarest fame. Yet now we see that here is found as greater faith in English ground. So you can see what's being said there. Livy, the great Roman writer, boasts about Lucretia, saying that she was this wonderful, faithful dame, but the Romans are rather lamenting the fact that she lost this garland of her fame, because of course Tarquin forced herself upon her. And then he goes on to say, yet now we see that here is found exactly the same thing in English ground. So Avisa is being compared to Lucretia straight away, and we know that Avisa, being Penelope rich, was greatly praised for her chastity by Philip Sidney in the famous Astrophel and Stella sonnets. He goes on about how constant and chaste she is. So exactly the same pertains. Livy is obviously representing Philip Sidney here in the modern version, boasting about her chastity, but all Rome laments she's lost it. All London, of course, is complaining that it's not quite right where Penelope rich is concerned. We carry on about Lucretia. Though Collatine have dearly bought to high renown a lasting life, and found that most in vain have sought to have a fair and constant wife, yet Tarquin plucked his glistering grape, and Shakespeare paints poor Lucrece rape. So there again you can see that there seems to be some comparison going on about what happened in ancient times with what's happened now. Collatine boasted about her wife's chastity, just as John Weaver seems to be saying that Lord Rich was boasting about the chastity of Penelope Rich. Very interesting, that fifth line there, yet Tarquin plucked his glistering grape. The word plucked means to, well, it obviously means to pick a fruit, but it also means to take away a virgin's virginity, to have sexual intercourse with a virgin. And this whole line about plucked a glistering grape is also referring to a line of Ovid. Ovid talks of the elm trunk, the great elm tree, which has the vine round it with the glistering grapes on it, and compares this to the great bond between a husband and a wife. The glistering grape is the beautiful loyalty and support that is held up also by the firm trunk of the elm, which is the husband. So it's a very clever line, this, because not only is it talking about taking the virginity, but it's taking the virginity specifically of a wife, and yet it's referring to it in terms of Tarquin. Those of you who have seen John Weaver Knew will know that John Weaver actually associates Tarquin with Henry Rosalie. I don't think I need to go on and on about Shake-Spear. I've already mentioned it once, but it is clearly an allusion to Pallas Minerva. It is also has a dirty overtone to Shakespeare, and it is talking about the hidden name, the pseudonym, Shake-Spear. Don't forget that Shakespeare of Stratford never put a hyphen in his name of any sort. This Shake-Spear verb object, very much indicative of a pseudonym who paints poor Lucrece rape, and you can all have fun looking for the name Penelope hidden in that lot. Okay, on to the third verse. Though Susan shine in faithful praise as twinkling stars in crystal sky. Susan is Susanna, the biblical, supposedly the chaste Susanna, but don't forget she was denounced by the elders for having sex in a wood. So it's rather similar to Lucretia. She's someone who's famed for her chastity, but yet has a taint, if you like, on her name. Though Susan shine in faithful praise as twinkling stars in crystal sky. Again, very much connecting the story of Susanna to that of Penelope Rich, who is Stella in the Astrophel and Stella sonnets. And I think he even talks of the twinkling stars love thoughts provoke. Philip Sidney says in those sonnets. So comparing Susanna to Stella. Penelopes means a bird, of course, but Penelope also talking about the character. Penelope's fame though Greeks do raise of faithful wives to make up three. So we've had three faithful wives, so-called faithful wives named, Lucretia, Susanna and Penelope so far. To think the truth and say no less, our Avisa shall make a mess. Please don't think that that means that she's going to leave all her clothes strewn on her bedroom floor or tip up the jigsaw puzzle, that sort of mess. This actually derives from the word for table. It means to make up for. I suppose you could say, if you had 3 people, please come and join us and make a mess, i.e. come and join to make a fourth at bridge or at table. And it was used quite often in Renaissance English, in early modern English, to mean a fourth. He goes on, this number knit so sure a knot. I think he's talking about the number 3 there, not the number 4. I'm going to leave you to interpret this particular verse. It's so dense with double negatives and double meanings, but I think just when I read it through, you can tell very easily that he is suggesting that all is not quite as pure as we think it is when we're talking about Avisa and these various wives. This number knit so sure a knot, time doubts that she shall add no more. Unconstant nature hath begot of fleeting females such fickle store. 2,000 years have scarcely seen such as the worst of these have been. Have fun working that out. But remember, he's saying this number, we're talking about 3. Actually, if you just quickly look to the top of the last verse, were these 3 happy? So 3 is very key to this little game. And now we're going to enter the world of cipher, which is always quite fun. The Elizabethans love this sort of thing so much. So let's do it. Then Avi Susan join in 1. What's he saying here? He seems to have lopped off 2 letters from Avisa and 2 letters from Susanna to get to Avi Susan. Avi in Latin, it means with bird. So Susan with bird join in 1. Remember, there are 3 names, so we're going to join them all with Avisa in just a second, but don't forget 2 letters are missing from there, from each name. Then we go to the next line. Let Lucrece Avis be thy name. Oh, now he's dropped off 1 letter from each name, and he's also making a joke here. Lucrece spelt like that is often the way that Lucretia was spelt then, but it's also exactly the same way that you spell Lucas, as in filthy lucres, meaning riches, and Avis being a bird, Penelope being a bird. So Lucrece Avis be thy name. Sounds a bit like hallowed be thy name, but what he's kind of cryptically saying there is Lucas rich, Avis Penelope bird. So rich bird be thy name. Rich Penelope. So he's kind of giving it away there. Now we've entered into this sequence. The first line had 2 letters taken from each of the names. The second had 1 taken away. So we should go to the third line, complete the sequence with Penelope and have no letters taken away. Oh, but he hasn't done that. So this is exactly the same technique as I was talking about on the title page, where Pallas Athena is lacking her most famous symbol, her spear, which she shakes, and we find it then in the name of the English poet. Here we're lacking the third in the sequence. So the first line's got 2 missing, the second line's got 1 letter missing, the third line should have no letters missing and should involve the third person, who's Penelope. So if we complete the sequence, we get Avisa equals Penelope. That would complete the sequence. Gives away totally that the name is Penelope. This was a discovery of Michael Mouton. Do go online if you want to discover more about what he's found, and he is very persuaded that Penelope is, of course, Avisa, but he's a Stratfordian, so that's a great problem for him. How he gets Stratford Shakespeare into bed with Penelope Rich, God alone knows. Where we expected to see Avisa Penelope to complete that sequence, instead we've got this English eagle soars alone. Slightly odd to call Avisa an English eagle because, of course, an eagle is a very predatory bird, and if we're talking about a whole book about a chaste virgin, then we should at least call her this English dove or something like that, but he doesn't do that. And I'm interested in soars alone. Interested because there seems to be something going on about Penelope Rich and being alone. This passage that you're looking at comes from a book by a man called Gervase Markham. At least Gervase Markham is the name that's written on the cover. Actually, I believe that this is written by Penelope Rich's brother. It's a history of the Devereux family, praising, particularly Penelope Rich's father. This little passage addresses directly Penelope Rich and her sister, who's called Dorothy, who's Countess of Northumberland. And it says, "But you, O you, you that alone are you, whom nothing but yourselves can match. Now, those of you who know the Shakespeare's sonnets very well will no doubt have some memory of sonnet 84. In this particular sonnet, something you might not have spotted, we get this funny little triangle of rich, pen and pen. In fact, if you look at that bottom line there and you take the second pen and move forward to the end of the line, you get L, Penel. And if you do the same with the first pen and go backwards, you see L as well. So Penel, rich. It's obviously alluding to Penelope, rich. But bearing in mind this line, which, as I say, I think was probably by the Earl of Essex, but you, oh you that alone are you, Shakespeare doesn't say exactly the same thing, but he says, who is it that says most which can say more than this rich praise, that you alone are you? Well, it seems to me very obvious that one of them is alluding there to the other. But I don't know quite what this thing about Penelope rich and alone and you alone are you is about. So if any viewers have any ideas, I'd be extremely grateful. It may be being hinted at then in this line, this English eagle soars alone. And there's quite a lot in the book about alone too. Quickly then to the last verse of this. Now we've established that Avisa is Penelope, because there is one little joke hidden here. Were these three happy that have found brave poets to depaint their praise? Of rural pipe with sweetest sound that have been heard these many days, sweet Willobie his Avisa blessed, that makes her mount above the rest. Now, Avisa, as I said, means a bird, as does Penelope, but it's slightly odd to talk about a bird mounting. Well, of course, birds can fly, but we don't often talk of them mounting. Mounting, to mount, of course, is a verb that means to get on top of someone for sexual intercourse. I hope some of you remember John Weaver New. In that, we found a bit where Henry Rosalie is described as Rufus mounting onto Stella. So exactly the same people are described as mounting. A bit of a dirty word, that, just as we had plucked, also the dirty word there. So what this last line is really saying is that Avisa, far from being the purest woman in the whole of England, she has more sexual intercourse than the whole lot of them. This poem makes it clear that she mounts above the rest. So we've seen right at the beginning that her name is Penelope, and I'm now going to take you right to the end and show how her last name, her first name is Penelope, how her last name is Rich. And we find this in the very last utterance that comes out of Avisa's mouth. Described as the resolution of a chaste and constant wife, that minds to continue faithful unto her husband, as if, to the tune of fortune. So she's singing it. This is actually a song. And we go to the very, very end of her song and her very last words. And she says, still will I sing, now well content am I. How is this giving away that her name is Rich? Actually, before I explain that to you, just have a look at the verse above. This is my choice, and wherewith am content. And look, 2 verses above there. Then let me rest, for now I am content. So she's saying 3 times, content am I am content. Remember, when we're decrypting things, so often we go by the rule, tria sunt omnia. 3s are all. That means that a decryption is validated when it is repeated 3 times. Actually, there's a hidden 4th going on here, as you sometimes get. Right there, the last line of that middle verse. God so provides that I shall never want. If you never want, it means you're not in need of anything. Why? Because you're rich. In fact, you're probably very rich indeed. So that's telling her that she might be called rich. And how, I hear you ask, is the fact that she says she is content, telling us that she is rich. Well, we've rather forgotten this saying now, but in those days it was extremely well known. The saying is, content is rich. I've plucked out 4 examples of it here, but if you go to early English books online, you can find absolutely dozens of them. It was a very famous saying, and what it essentially meant was stop being greedy and worried about money. If you're poor, it doesn't particularly matter, because so long as you're content in your mind, then you can call yourself rich. The second example here, you can see it's spoken by someone called Eag, and some of you will recognise it as coming from Shakespeare's Othello. Poor and content is rich, and rich enough. The second one comes from Sylvester's translation of Du Bartas. What should I seek or sue for much to live at rest? Content is rich. Fortune often is too free and often kills where she's too kind. But had we once an equal mind, we should all contented be. And the same thing, of course, being said in the final one down there, the mind content is rich. So famous was this saying that it was actually made into a song with music composed by William Byrd, who was a great admirer of Penelope Rich and who also set lines written by the Earl of Oxford. I wouldn't be at all surprised if his song Content is Rich wasn't in fact written for Penelope Rich with words by the Earl of Oxford.
Content is rich, but who is he upon the earth that lives content?
Well, I very much hope you've enjoyed this. The follow-on, the final part of this, won't be called Willobie His Avisa Part 3. It'll be called Henry Willobie Knew, and it'll show you what I'm sure you will want to know, that the author of Willobie His Avisa knew in exactly the same way as all his contemporaries did in the 1590s and beyond, that the name William Shakespeare was a pseudonym used by the Earl of Oxford. So please press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and press the bell, and when that next part is down you will be notified. Thank you very much indeed for watching.